Good day. This video, as all my other videos since essentially February, is going to be focused on the situation in Ukraine, but I do want to talk a bit about the SCO summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Samarkand, which is in my opinion an extremely important event, and also some information which has appeared in the Financial Times about how the United States and the EU are preparing to impose sanctions on Turkish banks that work with Russia's Mercouris. Anyway, I will talk about that later in the video. Let's first of all focus on the situation in Ukraine, which to an extraordinary degree still remains the dominant international topic. This despite the fact that lots of things are taking place all around the world, but most of the media attention, at least in the West, and of course I live in the West, in London, most of the media attention continues to be focused on Ukraine. And as I've said in previous programs, given the role the Western powers still play in international relations, the fact that they remain so focused, single-mindedly focused on the conflict in Ukraine, inevitably means that international alignments are starting to be shaped by the nature of that conflict. So where are we? Well, as I've said many times, any war is a fluid and dynamic process, and it's quite possible that by the time you watch this video, things which will have happened, which I did not know about and could not anticipate, and discussion of the military situation will have become, to some extent, overtaken by events. However, as of the time of making this video, it's clear that there's been a general stabilization on the front lines everywhere, except perhaps in the most important place, which is in Donbass. Here in Donbass, we're getting more and more reports that the advance of the Wagner group, I'm going to come to a discussion of that group shortly in this program, that the advance of that Wagner group around Bakhmut city is continuing. It seems to be, in fact, gathering momentum. It's now increasingly focusing, apparently, on capturing the important suburb of Bakhmut called Zaitsevo. This is a different place from the village of Zaitsevo that was captured some weeks ago. In another video, I confused the two, but this is a place that is perhaps better understood as a suburb of Bakhmut. And it seems that it's only now a matter of time before all the road links to Bakhmut are cut, and that the Ukrainian forces that are still defending Bakhmut become, in effect, trapped inside the city. Now, if that happens, I want to reiterate again what I have been saying in many programs. If that happens, that will be a very big event, much more important than the Kharkiv offensive or counteroffensive that Ukraine launched, which was dominating all the stories last week. It would mean the encirclement of a Ukrainian force, whereas even the British Ministry of Defence has somewhat grudgingly now admitted that the Russians pulled out of Kharkiv region in good order. It would mean the encirclement of a Ukrainian military force, a powerful Ukrainian military force in Bakhmut city, and either its retreat, leaving its heavy weapons behind, or perhaps alternatively its destruction. We saw the first in Lysychansk, we saw the second in Mariupol. And perhaps more important still, it would mean that this big city Bakhmut, with a population of around 75,000 but before the war, but with various other satellite towns connected to it, so that you could probably argue that the entire Bakhmut conurbation has a population of around 100,000, significantly more than the area of Kharkiv region, which Ukraine has now reoccupied. That all of that will have passed under the control of the Russians and of the authorities of the Donetsk People's Republic. And of course, in addition, and moreover, every single military expert, real military expert, people with actual military backgrounds whom I follow, is united in agreeing that Bakhmut is the key. It's the linchpin to the Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. That doesn't mean that if Bakhmut falls, if the Russians and the Allied forces and the Wagner Group all capture it, it doesn't mean that the battle in Donbass is ended. But it would mean that the end of that battle is now approaching. There would still be weeks, perhaps even months, of heavy fighting, especially if the Ukrainians decide to defend Kramatorsk. But to be straightforward about it, the writing in Donbass would be, for the Ukrainians, the writing would be on the wall. Elsewhere, we're also getting reports that around Donetsk city, incrementally, steadily, the trap is also closing around the other Ukrainian force, which is based in Avdiivka, this area where there's been shelling of Donetsk city by the Ukrainians, and which is similarly the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in the area near Donetsk city itself. So the Battle of Donbass, the most important battle of the war, the battle which basically began in April and which has been grinding on steadily ever since, that continues, and it may be approaching its culminating point. Now, that's the most important battle in the war. If the Russians and their allies win it, they will have achieved one of the prime objectives of the special military operation, which was to liberate, or as the Russians would say, or clear, as others might say, Donbass of Ukrainian forces, and thereby clear all the territories of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics of Ukrainian troops. One of the primary objectives would be achieved. Perhaps more importantly, Ukraine would have lost its biggest industrial region conclusively, and of course it would also have lost a territory, Donbass, made up of this complex cluster of towns and cities and conurbations and industrial plants, which has been easy to defend and which in a sense has been the shield for Ukraine. There's some commenters who have pointed out that even if the Russians do not first target Kramatorsk, in theory, if they were to decide to advance from Bakhmut all the way to the Dnieper River, they would be able to do so. And that could potentially split Ukrainian forces into pieces. Well, that's the idea anyway. As I said, I'm not the right person to discuss whether or not that's a viable strategy. Somehow I don't think so. But anyway, I've seen some people suggest this. So there we are. That's the battle in Donbass. What's happening in other places? Well, Ukraine has been trying to make further advances around the Oskol River line. It's not had any success there. There were those Ukrainian attacks on Krasny Liman. I'm going to call it that, by the way, whilst the Russians and the Donetsk militia control it. The Ukrainians refer to this place as Liman. If the Ukrainians ever recapture it, I will call it Liman, as I did when the Ukrainians held it before. But at the moment, it's Krasny Liman, and it's looking increasingly unlikely now that the Ukrainians will ever recapture it, because they made certain attempts to capture it shortly after the events in Kharkiv, and they were repelled by a very tough unit of the Lugansk militia called the Bars unit. Bars, by the way, in Russian means snow leopard. Perhaps it's named after a snow leopard. Again, I don't know. But anyway, this is one of the toughest militia units, and there was also other units there from the Rosgvardia organization. But over the last couple of days, there are now confirmed pictures of Russian motorized infantry rumbling into Krasny Liman to secure the defenses there. And I have to say, the presence of these Russian troops makes it extremely unlikely, to my mind, that the Ukrainians will be able to capture Krasny Liman. The Russians seem to be determined that any Ukrainian advances in Donbass, counter-advances in Donbass, in places like Krasny Liman, are unacceptable and will be repelled. Anyway, that's how it looks to me. Elsewhere on the front lines, there have been Ukrainian probing attacks near Ugledar, near Zaporozhye. All of them have been failures. There were a whole series of Ukrainian attacks along the Kherson fronts. And the thing that struck me about them is that, with one exception, they were all carried out with very limited amounts of troops. One attack in one place was with a company of men supported by 2 tanks. As I understand it, a company normally numbers around 100 men. That doesn't seem to me to be an indicator of a major offensive. Anyway, the major attack that the Ukrainians launched was another one of these harebrained attacks that Ukraine seems to have a habit of launching, which I simply do not understand. But there was an attempt, apparently, well, not apparently, it's essentially confirmed, by Ukraine to land a company of Marines by boat and helicopter on a place near Kherson city called the Kinburn Spit. Anyway, they were immediately attacked or counterattacked by heavy Russian artillery strikes. There were troops from the Rosgvardia organization, the Russian Rosgvardia organization there. The helicopter, one of the helicopters that was sent to support this landing, was shot down. Ukrainian helicopters were shot down. And as I understand it, this entire force was destroyed. Now, what makes this all very strange to me is not just that this already looks like a harebrained attack anyway. I mean, I would have thought that it would not be difficult for the Russians to counter an amphibious attack of this kind. But information that the Ukrainians were intending to launch this attack was already circulating on Russian internet and telegram channels hours before the attack took place. In other words, the surprise element, which I would have thought was the only basis upon which you could carry out an attack of this nature with any prospect of success, that surprise element had gone, and the security around this operation had been compromised. Now, I would have thought that a rational decision in that case was to call the whole thing off, because sending men against prepared defences in an operation of this kind is to send them, I would have thought, to certain death or capture. But someone, somewhere in the Ukrainian command system decided otherwise. The attack proceeded with all the effects which I've said. Anyway, there's been one other big event around the Kherson region, which is the one which was attracting all the big headlines, and that is that the Russians launched missile strikes against a dam in this region near the Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rog, which, by the way, happens to be President Zelensky's hometown. This time the dam was breached, which suggests that the Russian missiles that were launched against it must have been extremely powerful. Anyway, the dam was breached. There's been flooding in Kryvyi Rog itself, something which, by the way, pictures I have found extremely distressing. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but once again, pictures I saw from Kryvyi Rog were pitiful and made me feel desperately sorry for the people there. And by the way, also for some of the livestock, some of which I saw swimming desperately in order to survive, livestock presumably from the surrounding villages and farmlands. Anyway, a disaster for Kryvyi Rog, but perhaps more importantly, it led to a tidal surge, a river surge, along the Ingulets River. Now, in a program I did some time ago, I said that I'd seen some drone footage of a Russian airstrike on the Ingulets River, and that made me realize how small and shallow this river actually was. I use the word in the past tense because it's now clear that the reason that the Ingulets River had become so small and shallow to the point where it would not be difficult, in my opinion, to ford it. You probably wouldn't even need pontoon bridges in some places. The reason that has happened is because of this large dam located upstream, which appears to be connected, by the way, to the Kryvyi Rog's thermal power station. Well, there was this surge up of water down the Ingulets River, which has now become a much larger, stronger river with a much stronger current. It seems all the Ukrainian pontoon bridges built near Andriivka and there in those sort of places were swept away by the water. The Ukrainian troops in the Andriivka pocket, such as they still are now again cut off. It appears that other Ukrainian troops closer to the other place, Davidov Brod, which they've also been trying to cross south of Davidov Brod, if there are any, in places like Vysokopolye and all those places, may also be cut off. And it looks likely as if the Russians are now intending to clean up these Ukrainian forces. I apologize for that rather callous word, but that's the wording that some people are using, and that the Russians have therefore acted to make the Ingulets, like the Oskol further east, into a rather more significant barrier, preventing Ukrainian infiltration. Elsewhere, along the Kherson front lines, Ukraine has again made various attacks in various places, but all of these attacks have been repelled. Now, what we've seen, in other words, is a continuation of the grinding Russian allied offensive in Donbass. As I said, the battle there may be coming within sight of its end. Certainly probably will do if Bakhmut and Avdiivka are both captured. But in the meantime, Ukrainian attempts to maintain the momentum in some way of the Kharkiv offensive, but all of these attempts now running into organized Russian defenses. Instead of the Russians simply pulling back in front of the Ukrainian troops in Kharkiv region, they're now holding the line in various places. And the result is that the Ukrainians are now finding it increasingly difficult to maintain any advances. They, in fact, don't seem to have achieved any advances at all over the last few hours. And they are now starting to take heavy casualties. Well, I say starting to. Arguably, they've been taking heavy casualties since the start of these various offensives at the end of August. So, what we're seeing, and I'm not the only person who's saying this, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis has made essentially the same point. What we're seeing is that Ukrainian reserve force, all those brigades that Ukraine cobbled together over the course of the summer, re-equipped with tanks supplied by Poland, rather inadequate armoured personnel carriers supplied by other NATO powers, all that artillery, a lot of that's been gradually frittered and eroded away to perhaps marginal effective use with marginal territorial gains. Territorial gains which might look large in terms of Kharkiv region, but which have not changed the course of the war in any effective way. It is starting to look increasingly, the picture is increasingly starting to look like what I said, the various battles, offensives that were launched by Germany in the last months of the Second World War. All spectacular, gaining attention, perhaps giving the German leadership and the German population at that time an important morale boost, but in no case changing the overall military strategic picture. And on the contrary, causing reserves, causing supplies to be dwindled away. And there's been some information from the US which for me highlights the extent of Ukraine's potential crisis. There was a report in the US media, I believe it was in Business Insider, that the Pentagon is now becoming so concerned about the depletion of ammunition stocks of 155mm rounds, artillery rounds, that it is now frantically searching for US and Canadian factories that can start to resupply the Pentagon with 12,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition to replenish these stocks. Well, I have to say, if these numbers are accurate, and maybe they're not, but maybe they are, then they are disastrous for Ukraine, because it would mean that the Pentagon is looking to acquire 12,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition a month, whereas Ukraine is reckoned to be using 6,000 rounds of such ammunition a day. That's against the 20 to 70,000 rounds of analogous ammunition that the Russians fire every day. The Russians would be using more ammunition on a single day than the once mighty US, or at least North American, military industrial complex could produce in a month, and Ukraine would be using up in 2 days the entirety of the amount of 155 millimeter ammunition that the United States is producing in a month, or could be producing in a month. That points to critical ammunition shortages in the next few weeks. Once Ukraine's existing stocks of 155 millimeter ammunition begin to run out. By the way, I've also seen a Russian channel which reports that since 2010, Russia produces 1.5 to 1.7 million rounds of ammunition, analogous ammunition, artillery ammunition, a year. Now you can do the sums yourself, but you can see the extent to which even the US military industrial complex is being massively outproduced in this critical area of artillery production by Russia. We're not even including China, North Korea, all of these other places. And that, of course, if it's true, is critical for Ukraine. Now, I have repeatedly said if it's true, because these numbers are so catastrophic, if they really are true, that I'm almost left wondering whether they can possibly be true. In fact, they leave me speechless. But it would, if true, reinforce the point that people like Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis are making. This was Ukraine's last big effort. From this point on, they may be having increasing problems sustaining further offensive operations, and that might be explained, by the way, why their latest attempts at offensive operations seem to be running down, seem to be losing momentum. Anyway, that is the summary of the situation on the battlefields, and that is perhaps a discussion of things looking forward, if this ammunition story is true. I want to say a few things now about possible future developments in the Russian armed forces. Now, over the last couple of weeks, I have been saying many times that I've been struggling to understand the nature of this Wagner organization. Now, on the one hand, the Russians repeatedly say this is a private company. It's led by this rather interesting and colourful character, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who, by the way, played a significant role in the Russiagate hoax, or at least the US authorities attributed to him a significant role in the Russiagate hoax, which it turns out he didn't actually have. But anyway, never mind that. He is definitely the father figure of this Wagner organization. And he is a significant businessman in Russia with large business interests, though nobody has ever suggested, as far as I know, that he is in the top listing of Russian businessmen or oligarchs. And I wondered to what extent he really is the person in overall charge of this Wagner organization. I suspect that he does play a significant role, but I cannot help but think that the Russian government, the defense ministry, the foreign ministry, whatever other institutions we're talking about, that they largely fund it and that they largely direct the things that it does, be it in Syria, be it in Africa, where it's now becoming increasingly visible and playing a significant training role in places like Mali, for example, but also in other places. And of course, it's played a very significant role in the fighting in Ukraine. And it's clearly a very large organization. I mean, nobody has ever provided me with a satisfactory account of how many people are involved in this organization. But given its considerable geographical spread, given the very big role it's played in the Donbass battle, it must number multiple thousands of men. I mean, even if one accepts that these Wagner people are superlative soldiers, I mean, there's a limit to what even the best soldiers can do. And I can't help but think that we're talking about an organization that must number not just thousands of men, but I'm going to say it, even perhaps tens of thousands of men, perhaps 10, 15,000 men, perhaps more. So what is it? It's clearly more than just a mercenary outfit. It's clearly more than just a private company. Well, I am going to make a suggestion. I think it is in embryo an organization rather like the French Foreign Legion. The French Foreign Legion, for those who don't know, is a military unit which is part of the French armed forces. It's very much integrated within the French military system, but it opens its doors to recruits, mainly people who've had military backgrounds or military experience, but it's also willing to look the other way and accept people with unusual records, including minor criminals, people with minor criminal records, not the really serious crimes, not murder or anything like that, but people who've been involved in thefts and burglaries and that sort of thing. And it has tended to look the other way. It accepts these sort of people. It gives them a family. It gives them some sense of belonging to an organization. It gives them some kind of order to their lives. And having encountered people from the French Foreign Legion in the past, I would say that, putting aside what it's been used for by France, which is highly questionable on times, to put it mildly, in terms of the life it has offered some of its soldiers, it has actually steadied them. And by the way, that's something that I once heard a very senior British Army officer say. He said that the British Army also recruits young men who might get into trouble if they weren't able to find an outlet, a stabilizing force, if they in the military, in the British military as well. So this isn't completely new. Now, I make this point because there's no doubt at all that amongst some of the people who serve in Wagner are people with criminal backgrounds, criminal records, not, I suspect, major criminal records. The British Ministry of Defence has been making a huge play on this, but as I said, the French Foreign Legion does that. And Ukraine, by the way, has also done this over the course of this war. And it's clear that Wagner is attracting some people like that. Most of the people in Wagner, I am sure, do not have criminal record backgrounds, and it appears to be almost entirely Russian. I mean, the people who serve in it seem to be overwhelmingly Russian. There don't seem to be any attempts to recruit people who are non-Russians. And there's no doubt at all that most of the officers, many of the soldiers, are, as I've said previously, people drawn from the Russian special forces. And I can't help but think that what the Russian leadership is doing is that they're creating this organization. They're, for the moment, going through the fiction that it's a private organization, but they're attracting into it all sorts of people, adventurers, people who are looking for a stability and a family in their lives, former special forces people, those sort of people. And they're putting together a very effective fighting force which can be used like the French government uses the French Foreign Legion and has historically used the French Foreign Legion to execute whatever the Russian government's political priorities or intentions are in whatever part of the world the Russian government is interested in, be it Central Africa, be it Ukraine, be it Syria, or any other place. And I suspect that at some point in the future, probably we're talking about an event some years away from now, we will see a decision taken to regularize the Wagner organization by formally incorporating it within the Russian armed forces. So that's what I think the Wagner organization is shaping up to be. Now, about the Wagner organization recruiting people with criminal records, this has been known to many people for a long time, but it's not even a secret. I've now recently seen a film of Mr. Prigozhin himself touring military prison colonies, talking to young people there. They do seem to be fairly young people in their 20s, and inviting them to join Wagner, to redeem themselves, find themselves a family. I'm assuming that, as happens in most countries, many of these young criminals come from broken homes and things like that, and find some purpose to their lives. And for all I know, he's meeting a receptive audience. Anyway, that's what I think Wagner is. There is another aspect to this, which is another force which I want to talk about a bit, and that is the Chechen force, or what's called the Chechen force. Now, again, it's not easy to get a precise picture of its numbers, but it's clear that these Chechen troops, who had been given furlough over the summer after their heavy exertions in the early part of this war, that these forces had now been redeployed. They're being redeployed in large numbers right across the battlefields. They're present in Kherson region, in Zaporozhye, opposite Ugledar, in Donbass itself, in and around Krasny Liman. So again, that begs this important question: how many of these people are there? Well, again, like with Wagner, we must be talking not just about thousands, but perhaps even tens of thousands of these fighters. Very formidable and effective fighters they are as well. Now, this force, this Chechen force, is technically a part of the Rosgvardia organization. Its overall head is Kadyrov, who is, of course, the head of the Chechen government, but it has a military structure below it. I'm going to make a speculation that it isn't just recruited in Chechnya. It's recruited from all of the Northern Caucasus, from the people, the various nations, the mountain people of the Northern Caucasus, most of whom, the great majority of whom are Muslim, and all of whom pretty much speak Turkic languages so that they're able to speak with each other. Now, this is a revival of something that began to develop in the late Tsarist era. In the Tsarist era, The Tsarist government also supplemented the Russian army, the formal Russian army, by raising military formations from what you might call the martial nations of the Northern Caucasus. And in fact, a lot of leaders, in those days they were called tribal chiefs, I wouldn't call them that anymore, aristocrats if you like, North Caucasian aristocrats, who were people who were accustomed to thinking of themselves as fighters, willingly joined these formations, as did many of the young men from the Northern Caucasus. And actually, that bound them more strongly to the Russian state. That actually increased their loyalty to the Russian state. It helped the Russian government, the Tsarist government, stabilize the situation in the Northern Caucasus after the wars that had been fought there between the Russian army and these people of the Northern Caucasus in the mid-19th century. And I can't help but think that the same thing is happening all over again. That after the so-called Chechen wars, which were not, by the way, confined to Chechnya, someone in Moscow has made a decision to revive the same practice, to set up these Chechen or North Caucasian formations. Let's continue to call them Chechen formations. They're attracting lots of young men from the Northern Caucasus, young men who have a military, a martial tradition, and it provides them with an outlet. And of course, their leaders, the people who they look up to, they also find an outlet for their leadership qualities by taking senior positions in these units. And of course, if you go back, if you look at another empire, if you like, the British Empire, in India, they did exactly the same. They recruited forces from the Sikhs. The British recruited forces from the Sikhs, from the Gurkhas, from all of those people. And again, that actually bound these groups, the Sikhs, the Gurkhas, all the rest, more devotedly to the British Crown. Now, this is, of course, doing all of this is completely contrary to the practice of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet Red Army, which did not like having these kind of formations. Its assumption was that the Soviet Union was a single nationality, a single people, and that people from all of the various republics of the Soviet Union were brought together into military units and coalesced together. The Soviets did not like having, as the Tsar's army did, these complex units made up of, well, people from the Northern Caucasus, Cossack units from southern Russia, and those sort of things. Well, it looks to me as if gradually, incrementally, perhaps without really thinking this through, today's Russian army is reverting, in this respect at least, to the Tsarist model. And we already starting to see Cossack formations starting to reform. We've seen these North Caucasian formations. To repeat again, these are some of the most loyal forces available to the Tsar's government in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There's no reason to think that these newly recruited forces will be any different. Anyway, I just threw that in. I leave that as a topic for discussion. I know lots of people from all sorts of places follow these programs. They might all want to comment on this for themselves. I'm now going to turn to the other big event, which is the Samarkand conference. And we are starting to see meetings taking place between various important leaders in Samarkand. I gather both Armenia and Azerbaijan are sending people there. There's been another attempt to patch up a ceasefire between Armenia and Azerbaijan, though it's clear that the Armenian government in particular is now coming under intense political pressure. But all the indications are that the Samarkand conference of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is going to become a big affair. And just before I started making this program, Putin himself spoke about how Russia now welcomes the inclusion of Iran in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So we continue to see this process of what I call Eurasian construction, the gradual tying together through all these various Eurasian institutions, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Russia's Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Eurasian Economic Community, all of these groupings, they're gradually tying together this huge and potentially very powerful and very rich region of the world. And the important thing to say about this is that this is all being done in concert by all the great powers of this region. The dominant power, historically the dominant power in this region, is China. I mean, China has been heavily involved in Central Asian affairs, going all the way back to the Han Dynasty, which was set up in China around 200 BC and continued to be a major force in not just Chinese but also Central Asian affairs right up until its final fall in around 200 AD. So China has a very, very long history of involvement in Central Asia. So more recently, of course, has Russia. All of these regions, all of the Central Asian republics, were first part of the Russian Empire and then were part of the Soviet Union. Russian remains the lingua franca. Russia provides much of the military clout in this region. And the other great powers are, of course, Iran and Turkey. Iran was, for centuries, the dominant cultural force in this area. Samarkand and Bukhara, important cities in Uzbekistan, used to be predominantly Persian. I understand Tajik, a Persian language, is still one of the most commonly used language there. Tajikistan remains a Persian-speaking area. And of course, the dominant language of today's Central Asia is Turkic languages related to the language of Turkey. And of course, President Erdogan of Turkey is also participating in this summit, even whilst Turkey remains a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So we see that all the great powers that previously contested Eurasia between themselves, between each other, and which have at various times seen their influence over Eurasia wax and wane, they now all seem to be working together through these institutions to coalesce Eurasia with, of course, a universal acceptance that ultimately the key player, the dominant, biggest partner, will be China. And Xi Jinping is there. He's actually physically present in Samarkand. He's this first, apparently this is his real first foreign visit. All his other visits have been virtual up to now, but we've now seen pictures of him coming off his airplane with a huge delegation. He's going to be having meetings with all of the leaders of these places. And of course, his primary meeting is going to be with his key ally, who is Vladimir Putin of Russia, his key partner in integrating all of this entire region together. To my mind, this is the real focus of Chinese interest, much more so than anything else, more so than the Belt and Road, for example, though I'm not in any way downgrading the importance of the Belt and Road. Because what integrating Central Asia in this way is doing is it's providing China with that key strategic depth which it needs as it now increasingly faces off against the United States. It also gives China all those resources of food, energy, high technology, whatever, that it lacks in sufficient quantity for itself. So this summit meeting is a huge event, and it's being treated as such by the various surrounding countries. But note that one other very important country is also there, and that's India. Prime Minister Modi is apparently also in Samarkand, and he's also going to be meeting Putin, and he's also going to be meeting Xi Jinping. There's been much discussion about India, about whether India is aligning against China and Russia with the United States, what its relationship with all of these countries is. To my mind, it's absolutely clear what India is up to. It sees itself as an emerging great power. It has no interest in becoming the subordinate ally of any bloc. It sees its interests instead in forging its own future relations with all of the various blocs as it maneuvers for position. And I personally expect that over the next few days, perhaps weeks, perhaps months, we're going to see a major step up in the Indian-Russian economic relationship, with Russia working to become a major energy supplier for India, replacing Europe. So that's what's happening in Eurasia. And of course, the gravitational pull of this Eurasian bloc is growing. Other countries, other key important countries like Saudi Arabia, are also mooting the idea of becoming involved in it themselves. So that's Samarkand. Consequent upon Erdogan's trip to Samarkand, we're now getting reports. There's been a very interesting report about this in the Financial Times, about the US and the EU looking to impose sanctions on Turkish banks. And one of the reasons, the pretext for this, is that some Turkish banks are now agreeing to operate Russia's Mir card. And Turkish banks, which apparently are considering doing that, there's warnings now that they could face sanctions. I cannot imagine any step on the part of the Western states that would be more counterproductive. Popular sentiment in Turkey, never mind Erdogan's own complex negotiations and policies, popular sentiment in Turkey has been becoming increasingly hostile to the Western powers over the last 10 or so years, with events in Syria, by the way, acting as an important catalyst. If the US and the EU start to impose sanctions on Turkish banks at this time, it will go down very badly in Turkey. I do not believe that the Turkish banks are going to give up on the Mir card. Economic relations between Turkey and Russia are now becoming too important for that. What I think it will do instead is be another big step in pushing Turkey away. Already, the Turks have been infuriated by the US dalliance with the Kurdish militia in Syria. If the US now takes this further move, well, something that I've always doubted would happen, a Turkish decision to throw their lot in conclusively with the Eurasians and perhaps even to leave NATO, that might start to become a real possibility. Were that to happen, be under no doubt that there would be a dramatic shift in the balance of power, and I'm talking now about the military balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. We're still some way from that happening, and perhaps it won't. But US policy and EU policy, it seems to me, with Turkey, is now treading on increasingly thin ice. Well, this has been a long video covering many topics. Much more from me soon. Other things. I'm going to stop now. And in the meantime, please remember you can catch up with all my videos. You can find all of my videos, Alex Christoforo's videos, the Duran's videos on locals. We do other work on locals. You can find, for example, every Wednesday, I've not mentioned this for a while, but every Wednesday on locals at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, I do a live stream, a personal live stream, which is exclusive to locals. You can come to locals and you can join me there. It's easy to subscribe to our locals platform. You can come there and you can participate in that live stream. And you can also join us. You can also find us on Rumble, on BitChute, on Odyssey, and of course we now have a growing Telegram channel as well. Also, if you want to support our work, please remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and you can come and buy the great things you will find on our shop. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please, if you've liked this video, this long video, please remember to check your subscription and to press the like button. And thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon in this constantly evolving situation, and have a very good day. Until then.